This is a Media Lab podcast. Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. You're listening to a Sondheim adjacent episode. This is because of all of the great Patreon supporters that I have. We have reached a specific tier where each month I do something adjacent to Stephen Sondheim, but maybe not specifically about him. In this case, we're talking to Travis Moser about his career in Cabaret and his new album that just came out called So Many People, The Sondheim Sessions. Travis Moser, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. I love the conversations you're having, and I'm excited to talk Sondheim.
Well, I mean, that is obviously what this entire podcast is about. Like, you, of course, are singer, performer. If people go onto your website, they can kind of look at your entire CV and kind of your background and stuff like that. If we go back in time to like young Travis, like very young Travis, what is the first musical theater memory that you have?
So the first kind of professional, real musical theater memory I have is growing up outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was pretty fortunate because Pittsburgh has a really thriving performing arts scene. Marvin Hamlish was the conductor of the Pittsburgh Symphony when I was growing up, and there was Pittsburgh CLO, and all the tours went in there, and we have a Tony-winning regional theater there. And I was always the weird kid, like probably a lot of people listening and whatnot. You know, I would watch the Disney Channel at night for the Judy Garland show and old movies and old TV shows and Nick at Night and all of that. So the first real memory I have of musical theater in general was Joanne Worley in Annie at Pittsburgh Civic Light Opera. And to me, like I had watched like Laugh-In reruns and whatnot. And so seeing her in a musical live, and she did the whole, like, she added like Sock It To Me to like Annie. And so it's like, gotcha, I felt like to me, it was like seeing like Adele, because it was like seeing like my first like kind of like celebrity in a musical. So that's like really my first real memory. I was about 5 years old, I would say. I saw Joanne Worley and Annie. So that's my first, the first thing.
I love the fact that you were a 5-year-old and knew who she was.
Well, I was like anything like after 1960 when I was younger was like new, modern, cutting edge. Like I was watching AMC when they actually showed like, like the classic like B movies and all of that. So I was into all of that. So yeah, that was my first experience.
I've tried to do this for myself, so this is almost like an impossible question I'm going to throw at you. Is there any idea, have you tried to figure out what it is that attracted you so much to like, I guess that form of expression, like those types of performers? People can't see behind you, but I can see in the background, like the Judy from Carnegie Hall, like the Judy album and stuff like that, which is like iconic for me too. But it's like, what is it about those performances that were like, oh my gosh, I need to see more of this?
I think where I grew up was really rural. I grew up outside of Pittsburgh, but I didn't live in Pittsburgh. So I lived 45 minutes away. I lived in a town called Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. So it was a really rural kind of, like great place to grow up, but it was repressed emotions. Everybody like did things a certain way and this, that, and the other. No one wanted to stand out. So I think with musical theater and with people like Judy Garland, even like Joanne Worley or, musical theater in general, it was really like people showing big emotions in front of everybody on stage. And it just felt so liberating and so cathartic to watch them do that I think that's what drew me to it. It was the big emotions, the drama, we're going to lay it out here. We're going to feel these feelings and that I wasn't getting in my like small hometown. So I think that's like what initially drew me to musical theater and why I thought it was so amazing. And of course I love music, and my parents were big lovers of music and theater, and they really cultivated that. So it was a combination of all of that. And it was kind of like bursting out of quiet, like kind of not wanting to do anything wrong environment, I think.
For you then, like, was there a moment where it's like, I want to now do this? Like, was there a specific moment where it's like, I want to go and try out for this, or I want to get up and perform?
Yes. So from the time I was little, I took, dance lessons and whatnot. I tried to like balance it all. So I took like ballet and jazz, but then I was also like playing like baseball, even though I hated it, and like all these things, and to kind of balance it out. And so I always did that. And then I started taking voice lessons when I was in about like sixth or seventh grade.
Hmm.
And my voice teacher was this kind of like larger than life person who was a professional opera singer that had kind of stepped away from the performing and was a college professor in our area, a voice professor.
Right.
And her daughter lived in New York City, and she was always traveling there and going to see Bobby Short at the Carlisle. And she just like really opened my eyes to like this bigger world, and was always interested in performing, always loved performing. And then I started doing my high school musicals. When I was in seventh grade, I did Jack and Into the Woods, and that was my first kind of like high school musical, and loved it. I loved watching like Funny Girl and how she was like scrappy and different and didn't seem like everybody. And it's like I connected that, as so many people do, and decided like this is something I want to like pursue or be part of. And ever since then I've been a part of it, professionally and personally. So yeah.
Eventually we're going to get to the point here about talking about this album called So Many People, the Sondheim sessions that you released. But my question I always ask every first-time guest is, what was your first introduction to Stephen Sondheim? So was it Into the Woods, like you just mentioned, or was it something different?
It actually was something different. So basically, growing up, like I said, like Pittsburgh has a very like rich cultural scene. So I actually, when I was in elementary, went with my mother to a Judy Collins concert.
Great,
and,
amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And, I knew a lot about musical theater. We had seen a lot of theater, more of the mainstream type, big musicals and whatnot. And we were watching this Judy Collins concert, and she got to the point where, of course, inevitably she sings Send in the Clowns.
Right.
And she talked about how Prince and Jonathan Tunick and seeing the original production of A Little Night Music and giving Stephen Sondheim his first #1 record and a Grammy for her recording of Send in the Clowns, and all of this backstage kind of like leading up to the thing, and then singing Send in the Clowns. And it was before I was really like really immersed in Sondheim. It was kind of like I kind of knew about him and some of his songs, but this is the first time I was like sitting in a theater watching someone sing a Sondheim song live and hearing her stories and her connections to all these people. And, that really intrigued me. And a lot of her other music is obviously like pop, folk, whatever. So this like really, like I really connected with it, obviously, because it was musical theater and I was into that. And then I asked my mother about it. And then after the concert, and I was enthralled. And then I started researching on my own, and then buying, the cast albums and the Little Night Music original cast album and Merrily We Roll Along and all of that. And then that's how I kind of like really got into Sondheim. And then even before I did Into the Woods, which I did in high school and regionally, Pittsburgh CLO, I saw Leslie Uggams as the witch in Into the Woods.
Yeah.
And that was a great moment. So it kind of led all from the Judy Collins concert, honestly.
I mean, I guess there's two parts of this question, but just staying in that time frame, what show was it that you kept going back to after you're collecting all these albums? Like, what were you listening to a lot?
There's so many songs that I love and so many shows that I love Sondheim, but one of my favorites that I always go back to is Follies. I love the themes of nostalgia and looking back, and the road you didn't take and what could have been, and all of those songs. So that's one that I always went back to. I was always fascinated by the history of Follies and the motivation behind writing some of the songs. Like I'm Still Here, Sondheim thought of Joan Crawford, and that connects to like my love of old movies and all of that. So that's one that I always go back to. I mean, I have a special place in my heart for Into the Woods because that was like my first high school musical. Everybody always loves that. But but I'd have to say Follies is one that is always so fascinating to me. Like the original production, the original, Boris Aronson sets, and the concert, the Follies, the concert in the 80s. And I'm a huge Elaine Stritch fan. So that all kind of, that one's my go-to, the one that I was like always been the most fascinated with and wanted to read, the most about and kind of research the most.
Yeah, you're painting a very good picture here because it's like I can just picture the type of like teenager you must have been. And like, yeah, Follies is my show that I'm going to. And I love all these
Sadly.
old productions and stuff like that. The feather boa you probably wore to school.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm like smoking a cig with a martini, like talking about
right.
my divorces.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I'm not to like flash forward too quickly here, but at the same time, do you make the move to New York City then at some point?
Yeah. So basically, after I went to Point Park University in Pittsburgh, which is a big musical theater school, and there's a lot of people that have gone there. And like I said, my voice teacher throughout those 4 years, Ricardo Tobia, was in the original production of Pacific Overtures. And and he, had a million stories about Hal Prince, and he was he did the workshops, the production, the tour, like everything. So it's like, so that added another layer. And so he had lived in New York for many, many years. And most of the people that I went to college with moved to New York. But honestly, during college, I loved musical theater. I loved performing, but I didn't love the idea of like, the struggling artist and and all of this. And it's like, I really got into, above all, my love for cabaret and the art of cabaret performance and whatnot. So, growing up, I love, one of my first albums that I bought was Bobby Short sings Rodgers and Hart.
I've never met you, yet never doubt, dear, I can't forget you. I've thought you out, dear. I know your profile, and I know the way you kiss. Just the thing I miss on a night like this. If dreams are made of imagination, I'm not afraid of my own creation. With all my heart is here for you to take. Why should I quake? I'm not away.
And because that was a world, like I had theater at home, I had musical theater, I had plays, but the one thing you can really only get in places like really New York now is cabaret. And so that's what really propelled me. And I loved being myself and telling stories and sharing with the audience what I felt about these songs. That's where my interest kind of like lied and what I was like most interested in. I would go to when I'd go to New York, I'd see like Karen Akers and Betty Buckley at the old Feinsteins at the Regency and the Carlisle and all of that. And just that history. James Gavin has an amazing book called Intimate Nights, which is all about the history of cabaret. And I read that. That was the world. It's kind of like a bygone era that doesn't really even exist, but I idolized and really loved because it was something you can only get in places like New York, maybe a little bit Los Angeles, Chicago. And so right after school, I thought about moving to Chicago. I moved directly to New York. And for mostly my whole professional career as a day job, I've worked in Broadway advertising and marketing. That's kind of the path I took, having a job during the day and doing my shows and cabaret work and performances, at night. So that was so right after college, I moved to New York without really knowing anybody or knowing anything. And, just figured it out and, keep trucking along basically.
I think that oftentimes, even when you're talking to like high school students who are theater kids, that sort of thing, everyone, of course, they want to be on the stage and they're the performers, and that gets like the most written about. And yet at the same time, like there's all these other jobs that are associated with live theater that are obviously options that you can go into as well, whether it's behind stage or in the front office or whatever it happens to be. And you're still close to being able to do what you love. Yeah,
exactly. And that's the thing that you don't get in all of these small towns that everybody grows up in and then moves to New York or wherever. And is that there's so many other avenues and so many ways to make your own opportunities and to work in the business and have connections and do a whole bunch of things. So that was, I it's like the Dixie Chick song, like taking the long way around. I kind of I always am doing something a little bit different. And it's like, my thing is sharing stories and songs and with an audience and kind of being myself and talking about things. And as much as I love musical theater, like you really can't do that. You're telling somebody else's stories. So with cabaret and with concerts and with recordings, you can kind of tell your own story and whatnot. So there are a million different paths. There are a million different things. It's interesting you say that, because these are just things you don't. I used to just be fascinated with like all the cabaret recordings. There used to be like a lot of Broadway and cabaret people used to release a lot of recordings when CDs were still in vogue, and you could go to Barnes and Noble and Borders and like comb through the things of like live performances of like Dorothy Loudon at the Blue Angel and all of this kind of stuff. And I loved that. To me, that was like sophistication. That was like New York, like like Bobby Short at the Cafe Carlisle and all of that. So like I was always really fascinated with that. And there's ways to forge your own path, work in the industry, perform at night, do all kinds of things. So yeah, it's not just like be in the chorus of a Broadway musical.
Even to that point, like I kind of think have the same outlook on it, where I'm envisioning like the smoke filled rooms as someone's like crooning up on stage and it's like telling stories and like people drinking probably way too much in the audience. And there's a seduction to that for me. And at the same time, it's not quite cabaret, but as a person who also loves like the history of stand-up comedy in the United States, there's all these stories about all the different comedy clubs in New York and LA. And I am always so fascinated by like, who was the owner of this? Like, what's their story? What's their deal? Like, I want to know why, how they got into this. And like, they're the tastemakers. They're the people who get to choose who goes up on stage. So like, they're an interesting story too, that you never really like think about or know about. But there's all these other stories around what's happening on stage.
1,000%. That's so funny you say that, because anytime like Mark Maron, for example, on his podcast has like a stand-up comic, and they're talking about that like stand-up comedy grind and the clubs they played and stuff like that. That kind of stuff is so fascinating to me. I love the club culture of, like Joan Rivers and the old, school comedians and the cabaret performers. And it was kind of like a very enmeshed world in the 50s and 60s in New York City and what. And one of my cabaret idols, who I base a lot of this album, the Sondheim album off of, is Julie Wilson, who always recorded and performed just with a pianist. So that whole world is just fascinating to me and so glamorous, and it's just from another time.
For cabaret specifically, like for like a cabaret performance, for you, what makes like a great cabaret night?
I truly think it's being as authentic as you possibly can and really talking to the audience. Like there's a lot of people that do these like, I moved to New York and then I did this and then I did that. And it's like, it's so rehearsed and so practiced. I think it's really, you're having a party in your living room and you're inviting people over. And, this is kind of Elaine Stritch's philosophy. She didn't start really get into cabaret until very later in her career, like after at Liberty. She started, at the Carlisle. But, it was like, you're inviting people in your home. You're like, you're a host, inviting people in your home, and you're telling stories and you're interacting and you're talking to each other, and it's spontaneous and it's fun. And you have a certain through line and a certain outline of what you want to happen throughout the course of the night, but you're open and willing to all of the possibilities and anything that comes up and anything that happens live in the room, as opposed to having, like I think a lot of people don't understand what cabaret actually is. And they're kind of trying to create like almost like a musical theater piece in a cabaret venue. Right. Cabaret is you have a through line, you have a set of songs, you have some stories, you have some ways you think it's going to go, but you have to be open and ready to kind of go wherever it goes. And you're hosting a party and everyone, in the audience is your guest. And I think that's what makes, that authenticity, that willingness to go anywhere, talk about anything, interact with the audience is what makes it actually cabaret and a nightclub act in the like truest sense of the word. It isn't you were not doing like a one person musical or one person play that people are just, there's a wall in front of. And I think a lot of people, not a lot of people, but there are cabaret acts that do that. And I think that is like kind of like the antithesis of cabaret. So that to me, it's the spontaneity. It's the being open and willing that you're throwing a party and let's see what happens. That's
cool. What was the first cabaret you did?
So the first show I ever did in New York was at the Laurie Beachman Theater on 42nd Street here in Manhattan. It was called Wishing and Hoping. And it was kind of just all songs with the theme of wishing and hoping and trying to get to to reach a goal or try to get to something. And that was recorded live and released as an album. And that was many, many years ago. But that was my first ever cabaret performance. I did several nights of that, like I said, at the Laurie Beechman Theater. Laurie Beechman's another amazing cabaret artist that used to release a lot of. Obviously, she's a Broadway performer as well, but she used to perform at the Ballroom, now defunct club here in New York, and release a lot of those cabaret type albums in the 90s and early 2000s. And so that was exciting, and that was a place that a lot of the cabaret greats had performed. So that was my first kind of like taste of cabaret.
That must be exciting though too. As someone also, I love getting the opportunity to go like behind the curtain of old theaters. It's like, oh, like who's walked behind here, and like who signed their name on the walls over here, and you almost feel the history as you're walking through the halls.
1,000%. That's really how I felt at, I performed my solo shows and shows for other people at Fine Times 54 Below and Joe's Pub at the Public Theater. And really at Joe's Pub at the Public Theater is one of those venues that I performed at that like is, it's where Chorus Line started. It's where Hamilton started. It's like you can feel it in the walls. You can feel the energy in the air. And as an audience member, I've been to Joe's Pub and the Public Theater a million times. I see Sandra Bernhard every year there on New Year's Eve. And so those kind of venues, like you're saying, are you can feel it in, backstage. There's an energy that it is more than just, the performers in the building. It's like a history. It's like, there's an excitement that you can't kind of like duplicate just in another building. So yeah, that to me is fascinating. I love to be backstage at those kind of venues. And Birdland, I recently performed there in October. It's a legendary, jazz club, and just being in these places is, you feel like you're kind of absorbing some of that history. And it's just, I love it. I love the whole backstage culture. I love the whole history of all of it. This is
exciting for me because, fingers crossed, I'm supposed to be in New York City at the end of April. So I'm literally just like making a list of places to check out while I'm there.
In terms of like cabaret, Joe's Pub always has amazing, obviously like performers and Fine Times 54 Below and Joe's Pub. There's, it's really, cabaret is kind of like had like a resurgence with people like Bridget Everett and Catherine Cohen and all of these people that are kind of like a new age cabaret. And, like Bridget Everett performs at Joe's Pub a lot, and she recorded her special there to highlight Joe's Pub. So there is kind of a resurgence, and the clubs have really come back. Like after the shutdown, my first show back was at the end of June at the Green Room 42, which is a relatively new venue in New York. And, that was just, it was so exciting to be in front of an audience and see that New York, cabaret is always kind of like teetering on the brink. They call it like the fabulous invalid, like Broadway. Right. And it's like, so to see it come back and to see it still thriving and people wanting that intimate experience is really amazing.
That's cool. You also did a show centered around Rodgers and Hart as well, did you not? Or was it just an album you made?
Yeah, no, I did a show at the Metropolitan Room, which is now no longer in New York, but which was a great club. It was a comedy club for a while, and then it was a cabaret room that Annie Ross, the legendary jazz singer and pianist, like had a regular performance at. Marilyn May actually got restarted in New York at the Metropolitan Room. It was a great place. I loved it, and so I did several nights of my. It was called "This Can't Be Love," the songs of Rodgers and Hart at the Metropolitan Room, and then I did that 2 or 3 times at Fine Times 54 Below, and then as a benefit for Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS. And then I recorded it live at the Metropolitan Room. And that's a show I did for like many years because I loved, like I said earlier, one of the first albums I bought was the Bobby Short Rodgers and Hart album. And those lyrics and those songs to this day are so smart, witty, funny, touching. And so that was one of my favorite shows.
My head is to the pillow, nearer than the wind is to the willow, dearer than the rain is to the earth below. row. You're nearer than the ivy.
I wouldn't call like Rodgers and Hart like underground or anything like that, but definitely is overshadowed by the Rodgers and Hammerstein song catalog and stuff like that.
I think it's like they're a little bit more tongue in cheek. Like people think of Rodgers and Hart as like, oh, these fun little ditties, but like if you really listen to them, there's a lot of like darker undertones in there, and you know, people kind of like not dismiss it. They think that it's great music, but it's not looked at like your Sondheims, like your, right. You know, and it really should be, because the songs are pretty sophisticated stuff.
I mean, talking about Sondheim, this is a good segue here then. Like, what makes you decide to record this album called So Many People?
So basically, I was supposed to do we're still in the pandemic. I keep saying like during the pandemic, but we're kind of still in it here. But like, at that kind of more of the height of the pandemic and things are a little bit more dire and everybody was going virtual, I was asked to do a virtual benefit gala performance and like record me singing some songs, some Sondheim songs actually. So I called up my musical director, Drew Woodkey, who has worked on Broadway and Kinky Boots and MCC Theater. And he has a show at Joe's Pub actually coming up. And we've worked together. I had a Linda Ronstadt show I did that he was the musical director and pianist on, and asked him to do some tracks so that I could perform these songs for this gala. And I kind of recorded, I kind of wanted to do several of them to see which one was kind of best. And I wrote them in a very specific order. And I realized that during the pandemic, I was really like going back through the whole Sondheim catalog and a lot of the solo albums. And these songs were really like mirroring what my experience was over the last, like at that point, 5 or 6 months of the pandemic. And I had realized I had, you know, emailed him and talked to him about those songs in a specific order. And I thought like, even beyond the gala and everything and the virtual performance that was recorded, I was like, this would make a great EP of kind of like what my last, you know, 5 or 6 months of the pandemic goes through the lyrics of Stephen Sondheim. And so from that gala and from those performances, I got the idea of recording them as an EP, as an album. And so we kind of went from there, and they were in a very specific order of kind of like my feelings and what I was going through and what I thought, you know, kind of mirrored what we were all collectively experiencing through his lyrics and his music. So that's what kind of propelled me to do it. And then once things loosened up a little bit, we could go into the recording studio. There's a studio called the Smooth Spot here in Manhattan that I work at a lot, and 4D Audio in Queens. And you know, and then it became this EP, and it's been really great. It's been really fun. It's gotten a great reception, and
it just won an award too, right?
Yeah, it just won the Broadway World Cabaret Award for Best Recording. Yeah, it was just a great way to kind of like put all those pent up emotions and not being able to perform live for so long into a project, and it was so much fun.
So something that I've noticed while doing this podcast is like, there's one thing to enjoy a piece of music or come at it from a fan's point of view. And there's something different when you have to look at it, whether it's perform it or I read through the lyrics or I'm really analyzing them like line by line, word by word. Was there anything that I guess surprised you from it's 5 songs? I just checked this.
Yeah,
1,
5
2.
songs.
Yeah. So of the 5 songs that you're performing on this record, like, was there anything that surprised you at all now that you were actually performing them?
Yeah, I think like just the thing that surprised me as much is like how terrifying it was to actually record them, because it's like I love these songs and these songs are all such a part of my, like the fiber of my loving musical theater and cabaret and whatnot. But like when you go down to like lay something down, you almost like don't feel like you're worthy of doing these songs, and you almost feel like you know, like you kind of like second guess every single thing you do just because it's Stephen Sondheim and he has such a specific intent for every single word and every single note he writes. I think that's what surprised me most, is like how terrified kind of I was to kind of like lay these down and to, you know, try to get them right. And there were actually certain times I'd record it and think everything was right and listen back. And it was like, I'd have like one, you know, instead of an and, there was the or something. Then I had to go back into the studio just to fix that. Cause it's like, you cannot screw around with these songs, and there's just such a reverence, and it's like I think it's just I realized like how special and how he has such a specific intent to everything. And there's so many different ways of interpreting it that you could go around and around for years and years with each song and you know, to try to get the meaning out of it. But I think that that's the great thing about Sondheim and why his shows keep getting revived and why, you know, we're changing them in the recent Company revival. So yeah, I think it's just, you know, you have to just like go from your gut and how you're feeling and channel through what you think he's trying to say and just kind of go with it, because the fear can basically shut you down, you know?
Sure. Well, something else that I've been kind of thinking about here recently as well is that musical theater is this interesting beast, especially when you're writing songs for it, because I think there's one, how the song fits in to the show it was written for. And then secondarily to that, how that can be interpreted if you just take that song by itself and sing it. Because sometimes context changes, meanings can change because you now no longer have the context of how that's fitting into the show. And in a cabaret context, for sure, I'm assuming the same thing can happen is like, yes, like this song means this in the show, but in my cabaret show, this is what this means.
Exactly. That's perfectly put. And it's also like kind of like what's going on societally in the world as well. If you're doing it as a solo piece on an album or in a cabaret show, it kind of takes on a whole new meaning. And like you said, in a musical, it depends like how the actor is playing the role and what they're trying to do with it, because there's so many interpretations that it's like, you know, there's a myriad of different ways that you can interpret these songs, and it does change if you're doing it as a solo piece. Yeah, totally.
So now this album, so many people, the Sondheim sessions, this is such a leading question, but like, where can people find that if they want to listen to it?
You can find it anywhere you find music, you know, Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, Amazon, anywhere that you find music, you can get this album. And Playbill did a great piece on it not too long ago. And it's people that aren't, you know, performers or don't release music. It's so vulnerable to put something like this out, especially when it's something like Sondheim, that you know, whenever you put something like this out, you just want to like basically like hide under the mattress, you know, as Elaine Stritch would say.
Right.
But yeah, so they can find it anywhere that you find music or can download or purchase music.
This is always the question that people ask. You spend so much time making something, and then the immediate question is then, what's next? But what is next for you?
So I actually have a show that I'm planning right now that I just recently released a track that didn't make it to the Sondheim sessions, which was a recording of Something's Coming from West Side Story. So that just came out several weeks ago. And then I'm right now planning with Drew Woodkey, my musical director and pianist, a new show for City Winery here in New York. And it's going to be, actually, to bring it back, you know, full circle to the beginning, it's going to be a kind of tribute to Judy Collins. I did a Linda Ronstadt show. And the thing that drew me to her to Judy Collins is basically that was my introduction to Sondheim. My album just came out, and she has such a diverse repertoire of music that you can kind of pretty much perform everything. And I have I can't say who yet, but I have a very, very exciting special guest, a Broadway legend that hopefully will be part of the project. So that's what I'm working on now. And I have some other recordings in the works as well. So yeah, planning the next show and the Something's Coming. Yeah.
Now be aware, this is probably going to get released at like the end of March. So when I ask this, is there any way for people to come and see you live? Yeah.
So basically I perform all around the city. I don't have any like specific dates that I can say right now, but you know, I perform pretty regularly at, like I said, at the Green Room 42, at Club Cumming, at Birdland, and you know, check, you know, my Instagram, my website, travismoser.com for my City Winery if you're in New York City dates. And those will all be coming.
This is another great segue. Obviously, that's the website. Is there any ways, people can follow you online to see what you're up to?
Yeah, definitely. If you go to Instagram, I'm probably most, you know, whatever there. So you can go to, you know, at Trav James is my Instagram handle, and TJ at TJ Moser on Twitter. And you can follow me. I'm always posting my upcoming performances, my recordings, you know, old Broadway, old movie, old TV. retro, camp, all that kind of
Mhm.
stuff.
Yeah, Travis, thank you so much for joining me here today. This has been really great. I guess the last thing I need to ask then is there a song that you are dying to perform on stage that you have not yet been able to fit into a program you've made?
Well, in terms of Sondheim, the one that I have performed at a concert I
Mhm.
did actually back in Pittsburgh, that I did like an a cappella version is kind of like an encore. I actually want to do is Anyone Can Whistle. That's one of my favorite Stephen Sondheim songs. It's how I feel. It's like how I, like kind of like the outsider, that the things I think are easy are hard to other people and the things that are easy to everybody else. It's kind of like how my whole life has gone. So that is one song that I really want to perform. And I'm hoping that it'll be in the next show. And my dream is that the special guest that I have and I would do it as a duet. So that's kind of my dream and my goal here.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Travis.
Thank you so much, Kyle. This has been so much fun.
We had a good thing going.